How are you? Good, good. First, I want to kind of warn you, I don't give a conventional presentation, so you'll see that shortly. Just a little bit of background on myself. I've been with Ingram Micro. I don't know how many folks in the room know who Ingram Micro is. It's the largest distributor of IT and IT security equipment in the world. It's about a $50 billion corporation, presence in 131 countries. And I was very honored about a year and a half ago to be asked to work with them as their global cybersecurity consultant. Prior to that, I had about 35 plus years as an independent security and anti-terrorism consultant, 20 of those years working out of Beirut, Lebanon, covering the Central and Northern Africa, the whole Middle East, the Gulf states, South Asia, and a bit of Southeast Asia, the southern Philippines, island of Mindanao, and so forth. I've written about 11 books and research papers. You have one of the research papers there. This book up here won Security Industry Book of the Year in 2016. So we're going to talk initially about how major cybersecurity incidences can evolve and how events that are in the news can result in the background in a major cybersecurity incident. We're going to talk about an incident that's in the news right now. And so beginning with this, this particular crisis we're going to talk about all began with this. This is a Samar cruise missile, and it's made in Iran. It's a guided missile capable of hitting a specific building at a specific range. And these were given by Iran to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And so the Israelis were somewhat concerned about this, particularly in light of the fact that these can be nuclear tipped. So this is a problem for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and also for Israel. So both of these countries are quite concerned about this. That's a little bit of background. And they're concerned basically because of the regional geopolitics. So if we take a look over here, I'm sorry my pointer doesn't work at both screens simultaneously. If we take a look over here, here's Iran, this is Iraq, Syria, Jordan, there is Lebanon right up there, that's Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen down here, and Egypt is over here. So recently in the news for about the past year or so, Saudi Arabia has been essentially at war with the Houthi rebels down in this part of Yemen. And some things have happened recently that have escalated that. We'll talk about that in a second. Now you'll notice up here that all these red countries are aligned with Iran. All the blue countries are aligned with Saudi Arabia. And Lebanon used to be non-aligned, like Oman and Israel. However, over the last 5 years or so, they have become increasingly more aligned with Iran. So that's a concern to Saudi Arabia. Last week, this gentleman, whose name is Saad Hariri, is the current prime minister, well, was the former prime minister of Lebanon up until last week. So the Saudi Crown Prince requested Saad Hariri to come and pay him a visit last week, which he did. And while he was there, he was kidnapped by Saudi officials. Wow, that's remarkable. And he was forced to resign as the Prime Minister of Lebanon. So, which he did. So this began to create an international incident. Now, why would they do that? Well, there are three major factors in Lebanon, factions in Lebanon. There is the Sunnis, which and he is the head of the Sunni faction. There's the Shia faction, and Hezbollah is the head of that faction, basically. And then there is a Christian faction, which used to be very predominant and now has kind of receded in importance. And so with him out of the way as the prime minister, Saudi Arabia felt that they could make a statement that Lebanon is completely aligned with Iran, and therefore have a pretense for going to war. Now, you have to understand, countries don't usually like to fight wars, okay? Because, you know, kill people and break things. And so what they like to do instead is designate somebody else to be the area where the war will be fought. Let's not fight it on our soil, let's fight it on somebody else's soil. And who wants to volunteer for that? Usually Lebanon. And so the Houthi rebels, remember, in Yemen, last week also launched a Qaem-1 missile at Saudi Arabia's Riyadh airport. That's one of the Qaem-1 missiles. It's a long-range, very accurate missile, and it was targeting the Riyadh airport. The Saudis didn't like that. And so they used an American anti-missile defense system, shot this down very close to the airport. And so you can see things kind of bubbling up. So now we have the prime minister has been kidnapped and he's resigned. We have this missile being fired, so there's escalation. And so let's move forward and presume that a war begins. One of the major areas of my consulting for years was predictive threat analysis. So right now we're going to do some predictive threat analysis. Won't necessarily go this way, but this is one way that it could go. So let's suppose that Israel buys into the idea that Lebanon is now completely aligned with Iran, and so they begin a war with Lebanon in order to really fight a war with Iran, and that's the beginning of that. So they start off by bombing the airport, the Beirut International Airport, and they sink a vessel at the entrance to the port of Beirut. They blow up fuel storage all over the country. They destroy power plants and water plants, and also destroy bridges all over the country. Now, the net effect of all this in a country like Lebanon is that you've destroyed the electrical system, you've destroyed the water system, and you've destroyed the communications system, and you have destroyed the ability of individuals to go outside of their neighborhoods by destroying bridges. And Lebanon is a country with many, many bridges. So when you bomb significant key bridges, it makes it very difficult for people to move around the country. And so this is all very bad for Lebanon. So enter then HezbollahCyber.com. How many people here knew that Hezbollah has a cyber army whose specific role is to attack enemies of Hezbollah? So this is a convention of some of Hezbollah's cyber army. That's a lot of people. And every single one of these guys sits behind a desk 8 hours a day doing their job, which is cyber warfare. How many people here knew that Hezbollah is at war with the United States of America? Surprise. So these guys become very active. They have kind of a bad attitude about this sort of thing. So this is a screenshot from Hezbollah's cyber warfare. We are oppressed but not weak. We are waiting for you. Come with all your Israeli and USA made weapons. The message is short but clear. That's in Arabic, but anybody in the room can translate Arabic? In a nutshell, it says, you're toast. So once Hezbollah begins a cyber warfare, then Iran gets in the act. And Iran also has a cyber army, similar or larger in scope to that of Hezbollah. And they're also capable of very terrible, devastating attacks. We'll talk about some of those attack vectors in a few minutes. And then Russia, when the US starts to fight back against the cyber warriors, as the NSA certainly would, Russia gets into the act, and they begin to perhaps escalate it from simply cyber attacks into cyber physical attacks. This is an example of a cyber physical attack. In 2014, the first cyber assassination occurred in Italy. It was reportedly was a mobster against whom there had been an assassination attempt, and it was a failed assassination attempt. So he ended up in an ICU, in an intensive care unit, where the assassination was completed using an infusion pump, which was hacked. Oh, that's comforting. So this is the sort of thing that Russia has talked about doing. So our context again, we have Iran, we have Iraq, we have Syria, we have Saudi Arabia, we have all these countries who are at odds with each other. And we can see how a small event can rise up to become a major international cyber war. So let's take a look at a few healthcare security attack vectors and what this would mean. So this is all from the Center for Internet Security. So the number one threat against healthcare is ransomware. Also data breaches, distributed denial of services attacks, insider threats, and business email compromises and fraud scams. So those are the major attack vectors. If we take a look at who the potential attackers are against healthcare, we have number one. I'm just going to name these off, and we'll take a kind of a vote and see who thinks number one is. So we have private individuals who are upset and may want to make a statement. We have hacktivists, hackers who have an activist agenda. We have organized crime. We've certainly seen some of that. And then we have state-sponsored attackers. So number one attack vector, in the back of the room, we have a vote.
I would say state-sponsored.
State-sponsored is correct. Who in the room also thought that state-sponsored is the number one attack vector against healthcare? Very good. Most rooms wouldn't think that. They would tend to think it's organized crime. Organized crime is actually number two. And hacktivists are number three, and individuals are a very, very distant number four. So let's look at each one of these. So we have ransomware, and an example of this was the ongoing cyber war, which has been going on since the original attack, since Ukraine's government fell in 2013. The state of Russia and its contractors, hey, we have contractors. The state of Russia and its contractors have been conducting a cyber war against the country of Ukraine, against the economy of Ukraine, and against every single sector of the economy, including its healthcare sector. And so many, many hospitals in Ukraine have been taken down such that they have to operate with paper records and you know, in some cases without power. That's a monumental risk. Who here in the room thinks that Ukraine is the only potential target by Russia for these kinds of attacks? Nope. No takers on that. Absolutely correct. In fact, the general assessment is that Ukraine has been a practice area for cyber war by Russia, and this has been very, very closely watched by every single country's cyber war teams. Every major country has its own cyber warriors in Ukraine analyzing every single attack that's coming, and you know what types of software they're using, what kinds of methods and tactics they're using. Because at the same time that the Russians are refining their cyber war processes, everybody else is learning by those at the total expense of the government and people of Ukraine. So one of those was an attack called NotPetya. It was called NotPetya because it was not Petya. Petya was a previous a piece of ransomware that had gone out commercially, and the Russians pushed out an attack called NotPetya through a piece of accounting software. They literally embedded it in an update that was going out from the accounting software company, and when they pushed out their update, they infected every single computer that uses that accounting software with Petya, NotPetya ransomware. And it was a progressive piece of ransomware which then infected every network that it touched. And by the end of a few days, we had hundreds of thousands of computer systems around the world affected by NotPetya. And so that was a very severe piece of ransomware. It took many, many hospitals, healthcare clinics down. Here's another, a direct attack in June of last year against Ukraine hospitals, in which the hospitals themselves were, their own systems were attacked in Ukraine. Here's another one. Martin Gottesfield, who was with the group Anonymous as a hacktivist group, was charged over a hospital distributed denial of services attack. So we've seen that they can use that sort of thing as well. And also insider threats, which are really the worst of each of these, because insiders have direct access to much, in some cases, the entire system. We had a case in 2016 in which the chief IT administrator of Guitar City, I don't know if Guitar City is a major music retailer, went on the dark web advertising his credentials for sale to his company. And luckily, he had Guitar City had an IT provider that had a presence on the dark web. At that time, it was exceedingly unusual. After this event, it became much more common. And in fact, I believe that Evolve IP is looking at that capability if you don't already have that. So they found in a kind of a daily search of their clients on the dark web, found a flag for Guitar Center. They went in, took a look at it. Oh my goodness, we know this guy. And so they placed a phone call to the CEO of Guitar Center and said, we need to have a talk this morning. It's very, very important. He said, what's it about? He said, can't tell you. It's extremely important. He said, well, I don't really have time for it. Yes, sir, you'll have time for this. So he made time for a brief discussion, brought him in. They showed him the screenshots from the dark web, showed the information, and right there from his office, they called the FBI, and an arrest was made that afternoon. So these kinds of things coming from the inside are really just absolutely devastating. Also, business email scams and attacks. Here's a case where employees sued a home health care provider after a phishing breach. An HR worker allegedly fell for a business email compromise scam. So when we tend to think of an employee clicking on a URL in an email as having a profound effect on that organization, you have to understand it also can have a profound effect on all of their clients and their employees. And in this particular case, employee personal identifying information was compromised, and the employees of the organization sued the organization for that compromise. So this kind of thing can happen as well. So after seeing all of this, who feels a little bit like this guy? This is a scene from the movie Hero, in which at the end of the movie, the hero has just had a conversation with the Emperor of China, and he steps outside the Emperor's palace into the great courtyard of the Forbidden City, and as he steps out, 15,000 arrows are fired at him. So, you know, that's not a good day. Many of us can kind of feel like this person. So, you know, over here on this side, we have IT threats. Over here on this side, we have IT countermeasures. It's all can be very confusing. It's difficult to get context on all of this and to understand, you know, where do I put all this information? How do I hang all this information into a construct that I can make any sense out of? In the last 2 years, threat scenarios have changed from something that we should do to something that we absolutely must do. We have to deal with these competently. The new scenarios have become existential threats to all SMB businesses. Literally 20%, according to Malwarebytes' own records, 20% of the SMB customers who have had ransomware attacks against them are out of business 6 months after the attack happens. And that's typically because it takes them so long to recover from the ransomware that their customers go elsewhere and they never come back. So these really are existential threats. And they're very bad threats to large organizations. Target, from their 2014 attack, the final bill for that attack is still not in, and it has already exceeded over $500 million. So security, however, can be very, very confusing. We get a lot of mixed messages in the media and from different sources. What should we do? There doesn't seem to be a real sensible plan out there across the entire industry. You know, we have certain anxieties. How can I be sure that I'm doing the right thing? What will happen if I get it wrong? So there's a few things that we have to know. Number one is this. I come out of the anti-terrorism industry as a background, and the thing that we're most concerned about in that industry is something we call boom. Boom is bad. Boom is the security incident. But boom is just a moment on a security timeline. And if we look at that timeline, we have, come back here. We have over here a period called left of boom, which is the period of time before, that we have for prevention and preparation. And over here, after the incident boom, we have right of boom, which is the period of time for mitigation and recovery. So just out of a few quick questions here, who knows what the cost ratio is typically between, for an IT cyber incident, between left of boom and right of boom? 5 to 1, raise your hand. 10 to 1. Okay, we have one over here. 20 to 1.
I'll go 20.
One back here. 30 to 1. 50 to 1. Hands up? Okay. The actual range of these, and it varies widely, but the actual range is typically anywhere from 20 to 1 to 50 to 1. So that means if the cybersecurity solution over here, the prevention plan, would be maybe $100,000, then over here on mitigation and recovery, we can expect that to run in the order of $2 to $5 million. So it pays to get prevention right. I have been talking for a decade about IT security and have been saying something that up until very recently people thought was quite remarkable, and that is that I believe that IT security should be built around a compliance standard. And if IT security compliance failures can have organizational ending consequences. HIPAA jail terms can be very large, up to $100,000 per month per site, going back to the beginning of the incident, of the intrusion. PCI DSS compliance can have very high compliance. HITRUST can help. Why do I like HITRUST? I like HITRUST because of the things about it that are not obvious at all. And the chief thing about that is that HITRUST is a compliance envelope that can contain all of the processes that we use to resolve security projects and all of the compliance standards. HITRUST is unique in that it's a single construct that can handle PCI DSS, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, GLBA, European standards, and even standards for school healthcare records. So it's a single organizational standard that works across virtually any vertical: healthcare, retail, education, and government, military. It can be used for anything. And I think HITRUST also works in a 10-point plan that I have been talking about for a long time. And I'm just going to go through that real quickly. Point number one, and I think a program like this, in conjunction with HITRUST, gives a very, very high assurance of success. So one, begin in the C-suite. And why do we do that? I talk to a lot of CIOs who tell me that they own the data. And I'm very disappointed to say that I have to disagree with them. They don't own the data. They own the basket that the data is contained in. Who owns the data? The people who get penalized when it all goes bad. So that's the C-level executives. And they're the only people who can write the check. So I ask a CIO, can you write a check to fix this? And he says, no, I have to go up. Then you don't own the data. So the only person who really owns the data is the guy who can write the check. So we also want to get the C-suite to name a Chief Security Compliance Officer. And why do we want that? Number one, so that they have direct visibility into the compliance process. They're not doing the compliance, they're just having visibility into the process because they're the guys who are responsible, right? And also because this gives the team an advocate in the boardroom, so it's very important. And then secondly, we want to look at our obligations for data protection. What are the compliance standards that we have, state, federal, and contractual compliance standards like PCI DSS? And what are the assets that fall under those compliance standards? Do we have a laptop computer with unencrypted data sitting on the passenger seat of my vehicle as I run into the gas station to get a cup of coffee? That's a HIPAA violation. Okay? That's exactly how 500,000 VA healthcare records were stolen in 2008, by the way. So number three, current threat assessment. Who are the current threat actors? What scenarios are they using? What are the next generation of threats that are just over the horizon? This is an example of a cat that is not correctly assessing his vulnerabilities. The cat is looking at this bird and said, you know, I've taken down a few sparrows. This looks like a great dinner to me. And the bald eagle is saying, all right if you want. So this is going to be a bad day for the cat. So we have to be aware of our vulnerabilities. If we can't measure it, we can't manage it. Number four, and this is something highly unusual, and honestly I haven't seen any construct do this, but I think it's absolutely essential. Let's estimate our potential consequences. What would happen if we lost access to all of our data for an hour, for a day, for a week? What would happen if we lost our data to WikiLeaks or to our competitor? What would happen to our business reputation if this gets out into the news? What would our direct mitigation and compliance penalties be? All of these numbers can be estimated competently by the risk manager sitting down with the CIO and with the service provider. These numbers then come out of the organization itself. They're not numbers being pushed off to the organization. But it's important to have these numbers because the C-suite needs financial metrics. They're about making financial decisions. They need financial metrics to compare the cost of the countermeasures program to the cost of potential losses. It's not a return on investment calculation, but it's its direct equivalent. It's a return against potential future losses, so that's essential. Number five, take a selfie, define our security vulnerabilities, network security audits, security assessment, evidence of previous breaches if possible. And number 6, perform a gap analysis. And number 7, an IT security implementation program. Thank you. And then implementing that plan in a phased approach, testing each implementation, backing out something if we need to. And then number 9, training and testing on the hardware, on the software, and on configurations, and training the end users who are really the first firewall. We have to teach them what not to click on. And then number 10, reiterative processes here. So a good cybersecurity program can improve security, we would expect that. It can enhance employee and patient safety. It can also improve patient record privacy. It can provide organizational stability, and it can provide operational efficiency above systems that don't have good cybersecurity, because systems that have poor cybersecurity typically run slower than systems with very good cybersecurity. A lot of folks think it's the opposite, but it's actually true. And it can improve operational performances. We've got time for maybe just two quick questions. Yes, sir.
The Chief Security Compliance Officer, do you see a CISO reporting in through that?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct. And so basically, he's an individual in the boardroom who has direct access to finances. I'll tell you who I think the Chief Security Financial Officer ought to be, is the Chief Legal Counsel for the organization, because he's the main advocate for controlling risk in the organization. Another question. Back here, yes. Okay, the question was about Equifax. Is there anything that I know that could have helped Equifax? Yeah, pretty much just everything. That Equifax is a colossal example of phenomenally bad planning for IT security. It's just absolutely every conceivable thing that could go wrong went wrong with Equifax, including up to the event, the recovery for the event, and then the selling of stocks after the event. No problem there. So the biggest problem with Equifax, in my humble opinion, and it's just my opinion, was that, and this is an issue in healthcare in general, is that the customer is not, or the patient is not the customer. Okay? Sound like a familiar problem? And it's the same thing with Equifax. We are all the source of the data for Equifax, and yet we're not the customer. None of us volunteered that data. We didn't sign any agreement. There's no end user agreement that we signed with Equifax or any of them. And so Equifax is a canary for that whole, canary in the coal mine for that whole situation. I was very, very disappointed to see Congress rule that Equifax could not be sued in a class action lawsuit by the people whose data it held. I think that's an outrage, but that's, again, just a personal opinion. So one last question, and then we have to go. Any other questions?
I have a question, actually.
Yes.
Your thoughts on both, since penetration testing is part of the plan?
Yeah, absolutely important. One of the things I really believe in is, two of the things I believe in is penetration testing by a really competent certified ethical hacker. And secondly, is looking for evidence of previous intrusions. That's something that almost nobody does, and I'll tell you, when you come up to a client with evidence of previous intrusions, that is a phenomenally compelling argument for getting a better security countermeasures. But you know, the Wharton School of Business says if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's not just true for business, it's true for security as well. So, good. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.